absolutely most remarkable discoveries in the history of human biology. We're going to be talking about your brain's incredible lifelong ability to physically change, adapt, and literally rewire itself. For the longest time, we thought of the brain exactly like a machine. The idea was that once it was built in your youth, its parts simply stopped growing and just slowly wore out over time. But the truth is infinitely more fascinating than that. Your brain isn't some fixed machine at all. It's a highly dynamic, living ecosystem. Just like a forest that grows, shifts, and adapts to the seasons, your mind is in a constant state of biological reinvention. Okay, let's dive into this. For decades, the popular belief, and frankly, even the strict scientific consensus, was that once you hit adulthood, your brain was completely, permanently hardwired. We've all heard the old saying, right? You can't teach an old dog new tricks. The assumption was pretty bleak. You were handed a set number of brain cells at birth, and after a certain age, it was just a slow, inevitable decline. But what if I told you that every single experience you have, every thought you process, and every new skill you learn is physically altering the anatomical structure of your brain, literally right now? So, here's our roadmap of how we're going to unpack this biological superpower today. First, the hardwired brain myth. Second, how the brain rewires. Third, the dark side of plasticity. Fourth, extreme brain adaptation. And finally, number 5, harnessing your brain's power. Let's jump right into Section 1, the hardwired brain myth. To truly appreciate where we are today, we really need to understand how science historically misunderstood the very organ making that science possible in the first place. Throughout the early 20th century, the old dogma was just incredibly pessimistic. The brain was viewed as a fixed, non-renewable organ. Think about it. If you broke a bone, it would heal. But if you sustained brain damage or simply aged, you were supposedly completely out of luck because the central nervous system lacked any capacity to regenerate. Well, fortunately for all of us, modern research has absolutely shattered that depressing view, replacing it with a staggering new reality. The adult brain is actually a highly dynamic, continuously rewiring network. It exhibits profound plasticity from the cradle all the way to the grave. The journey to this realization wasn't exactly an overnight thing, though. Way back in 1890, the pioneering psychologist William James coined the term plasticity to describe the structure of the brain. Imagine being a genius, handing the world this groundbreaking concept, and then having the scientific community essentially ignore you for over 70 years. It wasn't until 1964 that a brilliant scientist named Marion Diamond provided the very first hard, physical evidence of anatomical brain plasticity. Her work was totally revolutionary, but it still took decades for the mainstream to catch up. Eventually, by the 2000s, advanced neuroimaging techniques arrived on the scene, allowing us to peer directly into living, breathing minds. And that technology definitively proved what early visionaries like James and Diamond had suspected all along. Lifelong rewiring is an undeniable biological fact. Moving on to Section 2, how the brain rewires. Now that we know the brain absolutely does change, we need to nail down exactly what this remarkable biological phenomenon actually is. Neuroplasticity is the ability of neural networks in the brain to change through growth and reorganization in response to learning, experience, or damage. And what's really interesting about this slide is the vast range of triggers for these changes. It's not just major physical trauma that sparks a rewiring event. Literally just learning a new recipe, navigating a totally new city, or even going through a period of prolonged psychological stress actively initiates physical structural rewiring inside your skull. It is a relentless, continuous process happening behind the scenes for our entire lives. Scientists generally break this whole process down into 2 distinct types. First up, structural plasticity. You can kind of think of this as a biological hardware upgrade. This involves the actual physical growth of new synaptic connections, or even neurogenesis, which is this miraculous birth of entirely new neurons in specific parts of the brain. Then, on the other side, we have functional plasticity. This acts a lot more like a software patch. If a specific part of the brain gets damaged by a stroke or an injury, the brain can literally shift that cognitive task to a completely new, healthy area. Sometimes the brain goes as far as moving a critical function to the entirely opposite hemisphere. It's a mind-bending process known as homologous area adaptation. But it's not all good news. Let's look at Section 3, the dark side of plasticity. As incredible as this biological process is, we have to recognize that it is entirely neutral. The brain doesn't judge whether a structural change is beneficial or harmful to your life. It just ruthlessly adapts to whatever inputs it receives. And when the brain efficiently adapts to bad inputs, well, we get maladaptive plasticity. Take addiction, for example. Drug use causes long-term physical structural changes in a reward center of the brain called the nucleus accumbens. It literally hardwires the behavioral compulsion for the drug right into the local anatomy. Or consider chronic pain. Prolonged pain signals can actually remodel the brain so severely that it reduces the overall volume of gray matter in the prefrontal cortex. The brain basically becomes tragically efficient at feeling pain, continuing to fire off those signals even long after the physical injury itself has completely healed. And then there's phantom limb syndrome. This is wild. A startling 60 to 80% of amputees feel profound pain or sensation in a limb that is physically no longer there. Why does this happen? Well, because the brain's cortical map absolutely hates a vacuum. The specific area of the brain that used to process sensory signals from that now missing limb is suddenly empty and silent. So in response, the surrounding active neural areas literally invade and take over that newly available neural real estate. This massive reorganization causes crossed wires and confused signals that the brain misinterprets as searing pain in a missing arm or leg. Now, let's pivot to something more positive in Section 4, extreme brain adaptability. Let's look at what happens when we intentionally push the brain to its absolute limits in a positive direction. One of the most famous examples in modern neuroscience involves London taxi drivers. To get a license over there, these cabbies must memorize a sprawling labyrinth of thousands of interwoven streets, landmarks, and routes, a notoriously brutal test known simply as the knowledge. These drivers spend years zipping around on mopeds, intensely studying this complex spatial map. Well, when scientists finally took MRI scans of these fully licensed drivers, the results were astonishing. The sheer act of acquiring this intense spatial knowledge physically inflated their hippocampus. That's the brain region heavily associated with memory and spatial navigation. Just by fiercely studying city streets, they organically grew significantly larger brain structures. And this brilliantly illustrates how this adaptability becomes even more extreme, almost like a superpower, when we lose a primary sense. In deaf individuals, the auditory cortex doesn't just sit there idle. The brain aggressively repurposes that dormant tissue to process peripheral vision and heightened touch. In blind individuals, the visual cortex is completely rewired to process sound. In fact, some blind individuals have developed legitimate human echolocation. They navigate their environments with stunning precision by making clicking noises with their mouths and sensing the returning echoes. Functional brain scans show something magical here. The click echoes they hear are actually being actively processed by the visual regions of their brains. They are quite literally seeing the shape of the room using sound. No way, right? But it's absolutely true. Which brings us to our final stop. Section 5, harnessing your brain's power. So the crucial point is, if the brain can achieve all of this automatically, how can we intentionally apply this science to upgrade our own minds? Well, to physically change your brain, you need repeated, consistent action. And to maintain that action, you need psychological fuel. Science tells us that as long as you see yourself moving towards meaningful goals, the chances are incredibly high that you will maintain the necessary level of motivation. Goal setting isn't just fluffy self-help advice. It provides the deep neurological sense of purpose you require to sustain the intense, repetitive effort needed to literally rewire your neural pathways. So here is your actionable roadmap to brain modification. First, set clear, meaningful goals to give your brain a specific target. Second, practice consistently. You can't just conceptualize or think about playing the piano, right? You have to physically sit down and practice. That physical repetition is what fires the neurons together, and as they say, neurons that fire together wire together. The repetition strengthens the synapses, driving the actual structural rewiring in your motor cortex. And third, you can massively accelerate this entire process by supporting your brain's biological environment with specific, targeted lifestyle choices. And science shows us exactly what those lifestyle choices should be. Aerobic exercise, for instance, floods the brain with a protein called BDNF. You can think of BDNF as literal miracle grow for your neurons. It prevents cell death, encourages new growth, and actively increases the volume of your hippocampus. Meanwhile, meditation has been rigorously shown to physically increase cortical thickness and gray matter density, particularly in areas related to focused attention and emotional regulation. And musical training? That is basically a full-brain heavyweight workout. You don't need to be the next Mozart. Even just clumsily plucking your guitar begins to enhance your motor, auditory, and cerebellar regions while building deep, robust neural networks right across the hemispheres. Now, if you're wondering how long all this takes, The answer is actually incredibly encouraging. Research shows that it takes as little as 15 months of consistent musical training to physically observe macroscopic structural changes in a developing child's brain. Now, sure, kids' brains are like highly absorbent sponges, but please do not underestimate yourself. While adult brains are slightly less plastic than children's, they are far from fixed. Your adult brain retains this remarkable, potent ability to rewire, adapt, and upgrade for your entire life. You never, ever lose the capacity for neuroplasticity. You are the active architect of your own mind. Every single habit you form, every run you take, every new language or instrument you bravely try to learn is actively reshaping the literal physical structure inside your head. So, knowing that your brain is highly dynamic and just constantly waiting for its next set of instructions, what new skill will you learn to